The first time Jane Whitfield heard the name Clyde Covington, it was spoken in the same breath as a warning, the way people whisper about rattlesnakes before you see one coiled in the grass. She had arrived in Dusty Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878 on the back of a hired wagon with nothing more than a trunk of clothes, a box of her mother's seed packets, and a deed to 40 acres of land she had never seen. The town itself was not much to look at. A main street of weathered storefronts, a saloon with a broken shutter that creaked in the wind, a livery stable, a general store run by a man named Henley who wore the same flour-dusted apron every single day of his life. There was a church at the far end with a white steeple that needed paint, and there was a telegraph office that sat beside the sheriff's building, which looked as though it had been constructed by someone who had only ever heard a building described and never actually seen one. Jane stood in the middle of that main street with dust settling on her shoulders and the April sun pressing down on the back of her neck. She was 24 years old, tall for a woman of her time, with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Her eyes were a shade of green that people sometimes stopped to look at twice, the color of the creek water after a good rain. She was not fragile, not in the way that word was usually applied to women of 1878. She had grown up on a farm in Missouri, and her hands showed it, strong and capable and slightly roughened at the knuckles. But there was something soft about her, too, something in the way she looked at the world as though it still owed her a kindness or two, despite everything. She had inherited the 40 acres from her late uncle, a man named Harold Whitfield, who had made his way to Texas in the 1860s and had spent 2 decades fighting the land into something useful before a fever took him in the winter of 1877. Jane had no other family left. Her parents had both passed within a year of each other, her mother from consumption and her father from a grief that had no medical name. She had sold the Missouri farm to pay her debts, and the 40 acres in Dusty Creek had become the last option she had left, which she had decided to treat as the best option she had left. It was Henley at the general store who first said the name. She had walked in to purchase flour and salt, and a few basic supplies to last her through the week while she got settled, and she had mentioned, in the casual way a person does when they are trying to understand a new place, that she was taking over the Whitfield property to the east of town. Henley had looked up from behind his counter with an expression that was somewhere between concern and the kind of satisfaction a man gets when he is about to deliver news that someone else does not want to hear. "That land borders the Covington Range," Henley had said. "You know about Covington?" Jane had said that she did not. Henley had folded his arms over his apron and leaned forward as though they were sharing a secret. "Clyde Covington has been after that parcel for 3 years. He made a deal with the bank that held the deed after your uncle passed, had the whole thing agreed to on paper, even had the price set. But the bank in Fort Worth sent the deed to your uncle's surviving kin instead, which turned out to be you. Covington did not take kindly to that. Can a man take kindly or unkindly to something that was never his to begin with?" Jane had asked. Henley had given her a look that suggested the question, while logical, missed the broader point. "You should know, Miss Whitfield, Covington is not a man who takes losing well, and he is not a man who is used to agreements not going the way he planned. Though to be fair, most of the agreements that go sideways on him are the ones he breaks himself." That was the first time she heard it, the reputation. The way people in Dusty Creek spoke about Clyde Covington with that particular mix of fear and reluctant admiration that small towns reserved for men who operated just outside the lines of what was acceptable. She heard more in the days that followed. From the woman at the boarding house where she stayed her first nights, from the blacksmith who shod her horse, from the older Mexican woman named Rosalinda who ran the laundry on the edge of town, and who always seemed to know everything worth knowing. Clyde Covington, she was told, was 31 years old and had built one of the biggest cattle operations in that part of Texas by the time he was 28. He had done it partly through hard work, partly through shrewdness, and partly through a pattern that people had come to recognize over the years. He would make agreements, handshake deals and written contracts and verbal promises, and then when the terms stopped serving him, he would find ways out of them. A land deal with a neighbor who had ended up with less acreage than he bargained for. A cattle purchase where Covington had convinced the seller to wait for payment and then leveraged the delay into a renegotiation. A business arrangement with a man in San Antonio that had left that man holding a bill Covington had originally agreed to pay. None of it was outright illegal, exactly. That seemed to be the particular genius of it. He always found the gap between what was agreed upon and what could actually be enforced, and he lived in that gap the way some men lived in saloons, comfortably and without apparent remorse. But people also said he was fair when he wanted to be, that he paid his ranch hands well and on time, which was not nothing in 1878 Texas. That he had once ridden through a hailstorm to pull a boy out of a flooded creek bed when no one else would go. That he had a laugh that you could hear across a room, and that it was always genuine. That he was complicated, in the way that only men who have decided they can live by their own rules tend to be complicated. Jane listened to all of it and made her own determination, which was simply that whatever Clyde Covington's reputation happened to be, it was not her business as long as the man stayed on his side of the property line, and she stayed on hers. She moved onto the 40 acres at the end of April. The farmhouse her uncle had built was solid if dusty, a two-room structure of rough-hewn timber with a covered porch that faced east, which meant she got the morning light through the front window and could watch the sun come up over the flat Texas land every morning. There was a well that still drew clean water, a small barn that leaned slightly to the left, and a kitchen garden space behind the house that had gone entirely wild. She spent the first 2 weeks cleaning, repairing, and planting. She got up before dawn and worked until her back ached and the light failed, and she fell asleep each night feeling the specific satisfaction of exhaustion that is earned rather than merely suffered. It was in the middle of her 3rd week on the property that she met him. She had been clearing a section of the eastern fence line, which ran along the border between her land and the Covington Range. Several of the posts had rotted and needed replacing, and she was working her way down the line with a post-hole digger and a cart of replacement timber when she heard hoofbeats on the other side of the fence. She straightened and looked up, and there he was. He was sitting on a big roan horse, watching her from 20 feet away with an expression she could not immediately categorize. He was taller than she had imagined from the stories, broad in the shoulders, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and 3 days of stubble along his jaw. His hat was good quality, battered from use. His eyes were a steady, serious gray, the kind that did not look away when you looked back at them. He looked at her for a moment, then looked at the fence post she was replacing, then looked back at her. "You are the Whitfield woman," he said. It was not a question. "I am Jane Whitfield," she said. "Yes." He did not say his own name, which told her he knew she already knew it. "Those posts are going in crooked," he said. She looked at the post she had just set. It was, in fact, slightly crooked. She had known that already and had planned to adjust it. "Thank you," she said pleasantly, "for the observation." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. "You planning to run cattle on this land?" "I am planning to run this land as a working farm," she said. "Grain, kitchen garden, and eventually some livestock, though not cattle." He seemed to consider this. "Your uncle ran some cattle on the back 20 acres. I had an arrangement with him for grazing rights." "Did you?" she said. "And what kind of arrangement was that?" He met her eyes. "A fair one." "My uncle did not mention it in writing," she said. She had gone through every paper her uncle had left carefully and thoroughly. There was nothing in his effects that documented a grazing agreement. "We had an understanding," Covington said. His voice was even, but there was something tighter in it now. "Harold Whitfield and I shook hands on it." "I do not doubt that you did," Jane said. She kept her own voice equally even, which cost her something because she could feel the particular quality of his attention and it was not comfortable to be in the center of it. But an undocumented agreement with a man who is no longer living is not something I can be bound by. I am sorry. He was quiet for a moment. The roan shifted its weight beneath him. You would be wise, he said slowly, not to be difficult about this. Jane put the post-hole digger down deliberately and looked up at him with what she hoped was a perfectly pleasant expression. Mr. Covington, I have come a long way to make something of this land. I mean to do that. I do not intend to be difficult, but I also do not intend to allow a verbal arrangement I was not party to govern what I do with my own property. If you would like to discuss a formal agreement for grazing rights, I am willing to hear terms, but I would want them in writing. He stared at her for what felt like a full 10 seconds. In writing, he repeated. In writing, she confirmed. He turned the roan without another word and rode back toward his range. Jane watched him go, then let out a long breath she had not entirely realized she was holding, picked up her post-hole digger, and went back to work. She was not sure what she had expected from that first meeting. Anger, perhaps, or the kind of bluster that men sometimes deployed when they felt their authority was being questioned. What she had not expected was that he would simply leave, quietly, without pressing the matter further. She was also not sure why the image of him on that roan horse stayed in her head longer than it had any reason to. She saw him twice more in the following week at a distance, once riding along the far edge of his range with two of his hands, checking cattle. Once stopped at the fence line near the south corner of her property, looking toward her house with no apparent purpose, and then moving on when she came out onto the porch. She heard from Rosalinda, who heard everything, that Covington had made inquiries at the land office in town about the Whitfield deed and whether there was any grounds to contest it. There were not. The deed was clean. Jane had that confirmed in writing from the county recorder within the week. She told herself she felt nothing about this. She told herself this was simply a business matter, a man who had wanted land that was not his and was finding legal avenues to pursue it, and that it would resolve itself in time. She was aware that she thought about him more than the situation strictly required. What she had not expected was the letter. It arrived on a Friday morning in the third week of May, delivered by one of the Covington ranch hands, a young man named Pete who handed it over with the careful neutrality of someone who had been specifically instructed not to editorialize. The letter was on good stationery, written in a strong and somewhat angular hand. It read, Miss Whitfield, I understand that you are setting up a working farm on the Whitfield property. I am writing to propose a formal arrangement as you requested. The back 20 acres of your land carry some of the best grass in the county. I would pay a fair quarterly rate for seasonal grazing rights, with the terms to be set in writing, reviewed annually, and either party free to end the arrangement with 30 days' notice. I would ask that you consider this at your convenience. Clyde Covington. She read it 3 times. It was direct and surprisingly reasonable. There was no bluster in it, no pressure, no implication that she owed him anything. She wrote back that afternoon. Her letter said, Mr. Covington, I am willing to discuss your proposal. I would invite you to come by the Whitfield property at your convenience so that we might discuss terms in person. I find written proposals easier to finalize when the parties have had a direct conversation first. Jane Whitfield. He came the next morning. She was in the kitchen garden when she heard him arrive, and she took a moment before she went around the side of the house to face him because she had noticed, and found mildly irritating, the way her pulse had picked up when she heard his horse on the path. She was not a woman who rattled easily, and she preferred to keep it that way. He had tied the roan to the porch rail and was standing with his hat in his hands when she came around the corner. Without the hat, he looked slightly different. Younger maybe, or simply more like a person rather than a figure on horseback. His hair fell forward slightly at the front. He looked at her when she came into view and then looked, for just a second, at the garden behind her, at the neatly turned rows and the green shoots already coming up in the warm Texas spring. "You have done a lot of work out here," he said. There was something in his voice that sounded like genuine acknowledgement. "Thank you," she said. "Please come up to the porch." "I have coffee if you want it." "I would," he said. They sat in the two chairs she had dragged out to the porch and drank coffee, and talked about grazing rights with a formality that was slightly at odds with the situation. Two people sitting in the morning sunlight on a creaking porch on the Texas prairie, discussing acreage and quarterly payments like they were conducting a meeting in a Fort Worth office. But the negotiation was real and it was clear. She knew what the land was worth. She had asked around and done her research, and when he named an initial figure she countered with a higher one, calmly and without apology, and he looked at her with that almost smile again and named a figure between the two. She agreed. She went inside and came back with paper, and she drafted the terms by hand at the porch table while he watched. She noted as she wrote that he did not look away. Not rudely, not with any obvious intent, but with a focused kind of attention that she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at things he was interested in. When she slid the paper across the table for him to read, he read it carefully, the whole thing. He did not skim. "You added the clause about fence maintenance," he said. "If your cattle are grazing on the back 20, it serves both of us to have the fencing in good condition," she said. He nodded slowly. "Fair." He signed it. She signed it. They each kept a copy. He stood to leave and then hesitated, and she had the strange impression that he was about to say something that was not part of what he had come prepared to say. "What made you come all the way out here?" he asked. "To Texas, alone?" It was not an unkind question. It was almost careful. "I had nothing left in Missouri," she said, and kept her voice matter-of-fact because it was the truth and because she did not want his sympathy, only his understanding. "And I had this land. So I came." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face that she could not name. "It is good land," he said finally. "I know," she said. He left. She stood on the porch and watched the roan carry him back toward his range, and she permitted herself, for exactly the duration of that ride, to notice that Clyde Covington was a man who was harder to understand than she had expected. Which was interesting. She had expected him to be simpler. The summer came in hard and hot, the way Texas summers did, like a hand pressing down on everything from above. Jane worked through it without complaint, because the work was what she had, and she had always found something clarifying about labor. She planted her grain fields, tended the kitchen garden, repaired the barn roof with the help of a young man from town named Eli who came out twice a week. She bought 2 pigs and a small flock of chickens and watched the property begin to fill with life. Covington's cattle came onto the back 20 in June as per their agreement. She sometimes saw his hands riding the fence line in the mornings, checking things, and they always tipped their hats to her and she always nodded back. She did not see Covington himself for nearly 3 weeks. When she did see him, it was unexpected. She had ridden into town for supplies and had stopped at the bank to deposit the first quarterly payment he had sent. And she came out of the bank and nearly walked directly into him on the boardwalk. He caught her by the elbow before she stumbled on the step and then let go immediately, and they both stood there for a second in the afternoon light with perhaps 2 feet of space between them. "Miss Whitfield," he said. "Mr. Covington," she said. "You doing all right out there?" he asked. "The summer is hard on newcomers." "I'm not particularly new to summer," she said, and then, because that had come out slightly sharper than she intended, she added, "but I appreciate you asking." He nodded and might have moved on, but she found herself asking, before she had fully decided to, whether he had eaten lunch. He had not, he said. There was a small establishment beside the general store, where a woman named Clara served soup and bread and pie on weekdays, and they ended up sitting across from each other at a small table in the back with bowls of beef broth and thick slices of bread between them. And it was, in a way she had not planned for, one of the better conversations she had in her first months in Texas. He asked about her uncle, and she told him about Harold, the few times she had met him as a child, The letters he had sent over the years that had always made Texas sound like a place where a person could be exactly as large as they were willing to be. Covington had known Harold for several years before his death, and he told her stories about her uncle that she had not known, small and vivid ones. Harold attempting to enter a mule in the county fair. Harold's ongoing and unsuccessful war against a particular family of raccoons who raided his corn every year. Harold sitting on his porch of an evening playing the harmonica badly, and without apparent awareness that he was bad at it. She laughed. She had not laughed in some time, and it felt like something opening in her chest. He looked at her when she laughed, and she caught him looking, and instead of being embarrassed about it, which would have been the more cautious response, he simply said, "You should do that more." "Do what?" she asked. "Laugh," he said. "It does something to your face." She looked at him carefully. He said it plainly, not as flattery, just as observation, and she found she could not be annoyed by plain observation. "What does it do to my face?" she asked. He seemed to consider the question seriously. "Makes it easier," he said. "Easier to look at," he said, and looked away then out the window at the main street of Dusty Creek, and she could see, from the slight change in his expression, that he had not meant to say quite so much. She filed that away and did not say anything else about it. After that afternoon, something shifted between them, not dramatically, not in any way that a person observing from the outside would have been able to name specifically, but shifted nonetheless. He began to find reasons to stop by the property when he was riding that side of his range. Small reasons. Once to let her know that a section of the shared fence line on the south end had come down in a storm, and his hands had already repaired it, which she should know about. Once to bring back a leather-working tool she had apparently left at the fence line without knowing it had fallen from her saddlebag. Once for no reason she could determine at all, just stopping at the gate and talking with her for 20 minutes about the summer rains and whether they would hold through August, and then tipping his hat and riding on. She was not naive about what was happening, but she was also careful about it. She had heard enough about Clyde Covington to know that the man sitting across from her in Clara's soup house was not the whole story, and she was not the kind of woman who let the good parts of a person make her forget the complicated parts. She asked Rosalinda more about him. Rosalinda told her things that Henley had not, or perhaps had not thought important. That Covington's father had built the original Covington ranch on the kind of deals that left other people short, and that Clyde had grown up watching that and had, somewhere along the way, decided it was simply how the world worked. That there had been a woman, years ago, a woman named Martha who had come out from Tennessee to marry him, and who had left after 2 years because she had said she never knew what agreement he would decide to honor and what one he would decide to find his way around, and that a life built on that kind of uncertainty was not a life she could stay in. Jane sat with that information for a long time. She thought about Martha from Tennessee, and about what it must have felt like to love someone and never know which version of them would show up. She thought about her own father and how he had always kept his word to the point where it sometimes cost him things he could not afford, and how she had always thought of that as one of the most important things a person could have. She also thought about the way Covington had looked at the grazing rights agreement before signing it, slowly and carefully, reading every word. The way a man reads something he actually means to honor. In August, there was a dispute. It was not between Jane and Covington. It was between Covington and a rancher named Darrow, who ran a property to the north of the Covington Range. The details of it filtered through town quickly, as details always did in Dusty Creek. Darrow claimed that Covington had agreed to purchase a section of land from him for a set price, and had subsequently offered a substantially lower figure, using some leverage related to a water rights question to pressure Darrow into accepting less than what they had originally agreed. Jane heard about it from Eli when he came to help with the barn on a Tuesday morning. She did not say much in response. But she thought about it for the rest of the day while she worked, and that evening, sitting on the porch with the Texas sky going orange and pink and then deep purple above the flat horizon, She made a decision that she could not entirely explain, even to herself. The next morning she rode out to the Covington ranch. She had never been to the main house before. It was larger than she had expected. A handsome structure of whitewashed timber set back from the main approach behind a double line of old cottonwood trees that her uncle had once mentioned as the prettiest thing in that part of the county. He had not been wrong. The cottonwoods were huge and shading and moved in the slight morning breeze with a sound like water. Covington came out of the barn when he heard her horse and stopped when he saw who it was. He was in his work clothes, a plain shirt with the sleeves rolled, suspenders, no hat for once. He looked somehow more real without the hat, more approachable and more guarded at the same time. "Miss Whitfield," he said. He sounded genuinely surprised. "Is something wrong on the property?" "No," she said. "Nothing like that. Do you have a few minutes?" He said he did, and he led her up to the porch, and they stood there rather than sitting because the conversation she had come to have was not quite a sitting-down conversation. She said it directly because she was not built for the kind of sideways approach that some people used to avoid naming things. "I heard about the situation with Darrow." Something changed in his face, something closing. "That is not your business," he said, not unkindly but firmly. "No," she agreed. "It is not. And I am not here to tell you what to do about it. I am here because I want to say something to you, and I think you are a man who can hear a thing said plainly." He was quiet, looking at her. "I think you are a smarter man than you let on," she said. "And I think you are a better man than your reputation suggests. But I also think that you have built a habit of finding the gap in every agreement you make, the way out, the leverage, and I think you have been doing it long enough that you might not notice it anymore. And I think it costs you more than it gives you. I think you know that." He was very still for a moment. She could hear the cottonwoods moving. "You came to my property to tell me that," he said slowly. "I came because I think someone should have said it to you before now, and either no one has or no one who has meant it the way I mean it." He looked at her for a long time. His gray eyes were unreadable in the way of deep water, things moving under the surface that she could not quite see. "And how do you mean it?" he asked. She held his gaze without flinching. "I mean it as someone who has watched you read every word of our agreement before you signed it, as someone who has noticed that your hands are paid before the end of every month, as someone who has heard how you pulled that boy out of the flood last year. I mean it as someone who thinks the version of you that exists in those moments is the real one, not the version that pressures Darrow into taking less than what was agreed." The silence between them was long and very present, the kind of silence that has weight and texture. "You are a remarkable woman," he said at last. He said it quietly, almost to himself. "I am a practical one," she said. "Are you going to honor the original terms with Darrow?" His jaw tightened. Then slowly something in it released. "I will think on it," he said. "That is all I asked," she said. She rode back to her own property without looking back, and she sat on her porch that evening and wondered what on earth she had done and whether it had been wisdom or foolishness, and she could not determine which. 3 days later, Eli came to help with the barn and mentioned, in his casual way of mentioning things, that Covington had sent word to Darrow that he was prepared to honor the original terms of their agreement. Jane sat with that for a moment, her hands still in the task she had been doing, and felt something bloom quietly in her chest. Covington came to the property that Saturday. He did not pretend that he was there about the fence or the grazing or anything else practical. He came up the porch steps with his hat in his hands, and she could see that he had made an effort, that his shirt was clean and his hair was newly trimmed, and she did not say anything about any of this because she did not want to make it difficult for him. He sat down in the second chair without being invited, which she found charming in a way she had not expected to find charming. "I want to say something to you," he said. "All right," she said. "Nobody has ever said to me what you said to me the other morning," he said. "In all the years I have been running this operation and doing business in this county, nobody has ever walked up to my house and said that to my face." "I hope it was not unwelcome," she said carefully. "It was the most welcome thing anybody has said to me in longer than I can remember," he said, "and I did not know what to do with it for 2 days, which is also not something that happens to me often." She said nothing, just watched his face. "I honored the deal with Darrow," he said. "I heard," she said. "Not because you told me to," he added, with a slight edge of something that was not quite pride but was in that neighborhood. "I did not think it was," she said. "I think you did it because you knew it was right." He looked at her steadily. "I think I did it because someone believed I was capable of it," he said, "and I could not stand the thought of proving them wrong." Something about the way he said it, the directness, the absence of performance, made her feel something that she recognized even as she noted that she had not expected to feel it quite this soon, quite this clearly. "Clyde," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name, and she could see that he noticed. He looked at her. "Would you like to have supper?" she asked. "I have a chicken stew on the stove, and it is more than I can eat." He said he would like that very much. They ate at the kitchen table as the summer evening cooled and the light went golden through the window. And the conversation moved the way conversations move when two people have found that they can talk to each other without the usual management that strangers require. She told him about her mother's garden in Missouri and about learning to read by lamplight when she was 4 years old because she had seen letters on a seed catalog and decided that she would not rest until she could read them. He told her about the first time he had ridden out to look at the land his father had left him, and about how it had looked like a problem and how he had decided to treat it like that, like something to be solved, rather than something to be afraid of. "Everything was a deal to me," he said at one point, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "Everything was a transaction. My father taught me that. You get what you can get and you hold it, and you find the angle in every agreement that protects you. I thought that was just how a person survived." "Did it feel like surviving?" she asked. "Or did it feel like something else?" He thought about that seriously. "It felt like winning," he said. "And winning and surviving are not the same thing, I suppose. I think I confused them for a long time." She leaned forward slightly, resting her forearms on the table. "What do you want?" she asked him. "Not from the land or the operation, just in general, what do you want?" He looked at her for a long moment, and in the lamplight his gray eyes were very clear and very serious. "Something real," he said. "Something I actually kept." The table between them felt suddenly like a very small distance. After that evening, there was no more pretending that what was happening between them was merely the practical relationship of neighboring landowners. It was not declared in any dramatic fashion. It simply became clear over the course of September that Clyde Covington and Jane Whitfield were becoming something to each other. The way water becomes something to stone, gradually and then all at once. He was not easy. She had not expected him to be. He had a habit of going quiet for days at a time, of retreating into the work and the business of the ranch. And she learned to recognize that this was not rejection, but simply the way he processed things, alone and in motion, on horseback and in the open air. She gave him that space without making him explain himself, and she noticed that he always came back from it with something to say that was more honest than what he might have managed without it. She was not always easy either. She had opinions, and she stated them without softening them, which he had come to appreciate but which occasionally produced friction between them. She was stubborn about her land and her independence, and there were moments when he tried to offer help in a way that felt to her like taking over, and she would tell him so plainly, and they would discuss it and arrive at something better. He helped her with the fall harvest. He brought 2 of his hands and they came without making a production of it, simply showing up early on the morning she had said she was going to start cutting and working alongside her through the long day. At the end of it, covered in chaff and dirt and satisfyingly tired, they sat on the tailgate of the wagon and drank water from the same canteen and watched the sun go down over the grain that had been brought in. "You know," he said, "this land could be something significant." "It already is," she said. He smiled. A full smile this time, not the almost one she had been seeing at the corners of his mouth for months. It changed his face entirely, and she looked at it for a moment longer than she probably should have. "Jane," he said. He said her name now with an ease that had come gradually, but when he said it there was always something particular in it, something careful and warm at the same time. "Yes," she said. He reached over and tucked a piece of her hair back behind her ear where it had come loose from its pin, and his hand stayed for just a moment at the side of her face, and she felt it all the way through. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Then ask it," she said quietly. "Would you be willing to come to the county dance with me next month?" he asked. He asked it with a seriousness that was slightly at odds with the question itself, and she loved him for that, the way he asked small things with his full self. She said yes. The county dance was held in the first week of October, in the barn behind the mayor's property, which was large enough to hold most of Dusty Creek and did. It was the kind of evening that small western towns in 1878 did well, lanterns strung up high, a fiddle player and a man on the squeeze box, long tables with food brought in by everyone who came, children running between the legs of the adults, old men in the corners trading information about the coming winter. Jane wore her best dress, which was deep green and fit her well, and she had let her hair down from its usual pins, and when Clyde came to the door of the boarding house where she had stayed for the occasion, she saw him take her in and hold very still for a second before he said anything. "You are beautiful," he said, and said it without flourish, the way he said things he meant. She felt warmth climb her face. "You are not so bad yourself," she said. They danced. She had not been sure he would be a dancer, but it turned out he was, or at least he was committed enough to the attempt that it came to the same thing, and she laughed more in that evening than she had in years. They ate at the long tables and talked with the people of Dusty Creek, and she noticed that Covington was different here than he was in business, easier, more generous with his attention, clearly known, and in many cases liked even by people who had complicated histories with him. She also noticed something else. She noticed that every person in that barn who looked at them together was looking at something they understood, even if Clyde and Jane had not named it yet. Darrow was there, the man he had nearly cheated on the land deal. He and Covington spoke briefly near the doors, and Jane watched without appearing to watch, and she saw Darrow nod with what looked like a grudging respect, and Covington respond with something direct and relatively brief. Whatever had passed between them had been settled and was staying settled. On the walk back from the dance, under a sky that was overwhelming with stars the way the Texas sky gets in October when the air clears, Covington stopped walking and turned to face her. "I want to be honest with you," he said. "You generally are," she said. "Not always," he said. "Not before, but with you I want to be." She waited. "I have not been a man of my word," he said. "You know that. The whole county knows it. I have made it a kind of strategy, and I have told myself it was business, and I have told myself that other men do the same, and that the world operates that way and a smart man takes advantage of that. And all of that is true enough. But it is also true that I have left things behind me that I am not entirely comfortable with when I am being honest." She looked up at his face in the starlight. He looked back at her steadily. "What I want to say," he continued, "is that I want to make you an agreement, not about grazing rights or fence lines, something else." "What kind of agreement?" she asked. "The kind I do not break," he said. His voice was quiet and serious and entirely without posturing. "The kind where I tell you that I am falling in love with you, and I want to do that properly. I want to court you properly and see where we go, and I want you to know that whatever I say to you, whatever I promise you, I mean it in full. Because you are the one person I have met in my adult life who made me want to be worth the agreement." The stars were very bright and very still above them. Jane looked at him for a long moment, at this complicated, serious, improving man standing in the October darkness, holding his hat in his hands the way he always did when he was saying something real. "Clyde," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am falling in love with you too," she said, "and I will hold you to exactly what you just said." "I know you will," he said. "That is rather the point." He took her hand carefully, as though the gesture meant what it did, and they walked the rest of the way back through the October night with her hand in his and everything that needed saying having been said. The following months were the most extraordinary of Jane's life, not because they were without difficulty, because they were not. Love in 1878 in a small Texas town was not a private matter, and a woman alone on her own land choosing to associate herself with Clyde Covington came with its share of commentary from the people around her. Some of it was kind. Rosalinda clasped Jane's hands one morning and said quietly that it was good for him, that she could see it in him, the settling. Some of it was less kind. There were women in town who had opinions about Jane's independence and about Covington's past, and the intersection of the two produced whispers that Jane absorbed without letting them change anything she had decided. Covington handled it by being very publicly a man who was changing. Not with speeches or declarations, but simply by being consistent in a way that people began to notice. He honored a contract with a feed supplier that in the previous year he might have found a reason to renegotiate. He paid a fair price for a parcel of land he purchased from a widow in the next county over rather than leveraging her situation. Small things, visible things, the kind of things that accumulate into a reputation that looks different from the old one. He came to the farm most evenings. Sometimes he helped with whatever needed doing. Sometimes they simply sat on the porch with coffee and talked as the Texas sky changed color, and she found that there was no subject she could not bring to him and no question she could not ask. He was honest about his past, not in a performed way, not in the way people confess things to earn absolution, but in the way of a man who has decided to look at something clearly rather than around it. He told her about Martha, eventually. About how he had understood even at the time that she was right to go, that he had offered her certainty while practicing the opposite, and that he had spent the years since then telling himself that he did not need anyone, but that the telling had never been convincing. She told him about the years after her parents died, the farm failing slowly, the decisions she had made from a position of being alone in a way that had nothing to do with solitude and everything to do with being the only person responsible for anything. She told him she had sometimes been afraid of needing someone because needing someone required believing they would stay, and she had not always been sure she believed that about anyone. He listened to all of it with the focused attention that she had come to know was his fullest expression of care, and when she was done he said, simply and directly, "I am staying." "That is not an agreement you can put a price on," she said. "No," he said. "It is the only one I have made in my life, that I know I cannot find a reason to break." She looked at him across the porch in the early winter light, the bare cottonwoods beyond the fence moving in the cold wind, and she felt something settle in her that had not been still in years. November turned to December, and the Texas winter was mild by northern standards but cold enough for wool and fires, and Covington began spending more evenings at the farmhouse, sometimes not riding back to his own property until the stars were well up, and both of them were aware that this arrangement was moving towards something, and neither of them was pretending otherwise. He proposed to her on a Thursday, not a special day by any external measure. She had been splitting kindling on the side of the house when he rode up, and she had looked up at him with her hair in a rough braid and her coat covered in wood chips, and he had gotten down from the roan and walked over to her and taken the axe from her hands and set it carefully against the woodpile, and then stood there in front of her in the December cold. "I want to marry you," he said. "I have been wanting to say it for a month, and I have been finding reasons to wait for a better moment, and I think I am just going to say it now instead." She looked at him. Her heart was doing something she could feel in her throat. "Because there might not be a better moment," he continued, "or there might be, but you have taught me that the right thing said at the right time is better than the right thing said perfectly, and I know this is right, so, will you marry me?" She reached up and put her cold hand against his jaw, and he turned slightly into it the way something warm turns toward warmth. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." He put both of his arms around her and held her there in the December cold with the woodpile at her back and the horses watching without any particular interest. And she felt his breath in her hair, and the solid warmth of him, and the specific peace of someone who is exactly where they are supposed to be. They were married in February of 1879, at the church with the white steeple that still needed painting, on a cold, bright day when the sun came in through the windows at an angle that made everything look like something remembered rather than something happening. The whole town came, or most of it, because Dusty Creek was a town that took its wedding seriously, and because this particular wedding had been anticipated with the pleasure that communities feel when two people who clearly belong together finally arrive at the obvious conclusion. Rosalinda sat in the front pew and cried in a dignified way. Henley had cleaned his apron for the occasion. Pete, the ranch hand, stood as one of the witnesses with an expression of someone who had seen a great deal and was pleased with how this particular thing had turned out. Jane walked herself down the aisle because she had no one to walk her, and because she had decided, with characteristic practicality, that this was not a deficit but simply a fact, and she walked it with her chin up and her eyes on Clyde, who stood at the front of the church and watched her come toward him with an expression that she had never seen on his face before, and that she would keep for the rest of her life. It was simple and full and entirely unguarded, the face of a man who could not believe his luck and was not trying to hide it. They spoke their vows in the old language, the language of 1879 and the Texas prairie, to have and to hold, to honor and to keep. And Clyde said every word of it with the directness that was his way of saying things he fully meant. And Jane said it back with a certainty that had taken her a long way and a full year to arrive at, and it was the truest agreement either of them had ever made. The winter passed into spring again, the second spring on Jane's land, and now it was their land, though she kept the deed in both names and both of them preferred it that way. She had moved into the farmhouse where she had started, and he had begun to spend less time at the main Covington house and more time on what they had begun simply to call the East property, which was what her original 40 acres had become. They built it up together, and that was the right word, built, because it was work and partnership and not always agreement on every detail, but always a return to each other after the disagreement, always the willingness to hear the other out and to yield when yielding was right and to stand when standing was right, and to know the difference. Clyde hired a foreman for the main ranch who could run the cattle operation day to day, and he turned more of his attention to the combined properties, to what Jane had planted and what she was growing toward, and he was surprised to find, in this particular adjustment, something that felt more satisfying than the transactions and angles and deals he had spent his years accumulating. In the spring of 1879, Jane found that she was expecting their first child. She told Clyde on a Tuesday evening, sitting on the porch, matter-of-factly and with a smile that she could not quite keep contained, and his face went through several things in rapid succession before landing on something that was barely containable joy. He picked her up, which she found both undignified and charming, and she laughed the laugh that did something to her face, and he set her down and held her by the shoulders and looked at her seriously. "You are all right?" he asked. "You feel well?" "I feel completely well," she assured him. "You will tell me if you need anything," he said. "Anything at all." "Clyde," she said, because she knew what he was doing, the way he expressed care through practicality, through ensuring, through making certain. "I am strong and healthy, and this is good news. You do not have to manage it." He let out a breath that was half a laugh. "I know," he said. "I know, he stopped. "What?" she said. "I had not thought I would have this," he said quietly. "Any of this. I thought I would run the ranch and make the deals, and that would be the whole of it. I had made my peace with that." She put her hand in his. "Are you glad to have been wrong?" she asked. "Every day," he said. Their son was born in November of 1879, and they named him Harold after her uncle, which felt right, a continuity of something good forward into a life that was being built on better foundations than the ones before it. Harold Covington was a substantial baby with a full head of dark hair, and his father's gray eyes from the first week, which Clyde took as a personal vindication of something he could not entirely explain. He was a good infant, alert and opinionated in the way that babies can be opinionated, and Clyde took to fatherhood with the same focused and slightly intense engagement he brought to everything he cared about. Jane watched him in the evenings, in the lamplight of the farmhouse that had been theirs for almost a year now, walking the length of the room with the baby on his shoulder, talking to Harold in a low murmur about the ranch and the land and what it would all look like in 20 years, plans unspooling into the ear of a child who was asleep before the first paragraph was finished, and she felt something she could only call complete. The following year brought growth in both directions. The farm produced its best crop yet in the summer of 1880, and Clyde's cattle operation expanded in a way that was more careful than his previous expansions had been, grounded in solid agreements with the people around him, agreements he honored without looking for the exits. His reputation in Dusty Creek had shifted. It was a gradual shift, the kind that happens over time when a person's actions begin to contradict the story that was told about them, and then keep contradicting it until the story needs to be updated. People in town still remembered the old Covington, the one who found the angle in every deal. But they were beginning to know a different one, the one who shook hands and meant it, the one whose word had begun to mean something in the county, the one who sometimes cited, with a frankness that people found surprising, having made some deals he was not proud of and having had a reason to do better. He said it, when he said it at all, without self-pity and without performance. He said it the way a man says something he has simply concluded to be true. Darrow became, over the course of 1880, something approaching a friend, or at least the Western masculine equivalent of a friend, which was primarily expressed through a willingness to share information about water tables and cattle prices, and to occasionally sit beside each other at the counter in Clara's establishment with no particular agenda. It was not a warm friendship, but it was a real one, and it was built on the specific foundation of Covington having chosen to honor what was right over what was advantageous, which Darrow had not forgotten. Jane and Clyde had the kind of arguments that people who are genuinely committed to each other have, not the small, polite disagreements of people who are being careful, but the real and sometimes pointed ones that arise from two people who both have strong ideas about the world and are trying to build something together. They argued about money once, about how much to reinvest in the property versus setting aside reserves, and the argument went on for 2 evenings before arriving somewhere they both could stand. They argued about a hired hand who Jane thought was being underpaid and Clyde initially disagreed, and then, after thinking about it, concluded she was right and adjusted the wages without needing to be told twice. They were good arguments, in the sense that they were the arguments of people who respected each other enough to disagree honestly, and they always ended in the same place, returned to each other, to the certainty that whatever was being worked out was worth working out because it was being worked out together. Rosalinda came to dinner at the farmhouse once a month or so, and these evenings were ones that Jane treasured, the warmth and the stories, and the particular wisdom of a woman who had lived a long and complicated life, in a place where life asked difficult things of people who were not of the dominant culture, and who had managed nonetheless to become someone who understood everything worth understanding about the human heart. Rosalinda had lived in Texas long before it was Texas in the current sense, and she carried with her a knowledge of the land and its history, and its injustices that she shared with a frankness that both Clyde and Jane had come to value deeply. She spoke about what had been taken, about the lives that had been displaced by the spread of ranching and farming, and the particular westward movement that had made places like Dusty Creek possible. She did not accuse, but she did not smooth it over either, and Jane, who had sometimes not known how to hold the fact of her own presence on this land in relation to the people who had lived on it before, found that Rosalinda's honesty made it possible to hold it more squarely, to be aware of it, and to act from that awareness even in small and imperfect ways. It was at one of these dinners that Rosalinda looked at the two of them across the table, at Jane with the lamplight on her face and Harold on her knee nearly asleep, and Clyde leaning back in his chair with the ease of a man in the home he belongs in, and she said simply, "Good. This is good." And it was. In the spring of 1881, Jane found herself expecting again. This time the pregnancy was harder, with a weariness in the first months that laid her lower than she was accustomed to being, and it was in this period that she saw clearly what kind of man she had married. Clyde did not hover in the anxious and well-meaning way that she had slightly feared. He was practical about it, and practicality was his expression of love. He hired an additional hand for the farm work she normally did herself. He made sure there was always hot food in the house even when he was at the ranch for the day. He came in each evening and asked her directly how she felt and listened to the real answer. And when she said she felt difficult, he did not try to tell her she should feel otherwise. On the evenings when she felt well enough, they walked out to the east end of the property, past the kitchen garden and the grain fields, to a slight rise where you could see both their properties laid out in the light, the cattle on the Covington range and the crops on the Whitfield acres, and everything that had come from two people deciding to build something together. He held her hand on these walks, and they talked about Harold's first words, which had arrived with an enthusiasm that suggested he had been waiting impatiently to begin speaking, and about what they would plant in the fall, and about the telegraph line that was supposed to reach Dusty Creek by the following year, which would change things, and about the future in general, as people do when the future feels solid and real. Their daughter was born in October of 1881, and they named her Clara, after the woman who had fed them soup in the small establishment on the main street, on one of the first days that everything had begun, which was Jane's idea, and which Clyde agreed to with a warmth that suggested he understood exactly what she meant by it. Clara was small and fierce from the beginning, with her mother's green eyes and a disposition that made clear she had opinions about everything and intended to share all of them. Harold, who was 2 years old and deeply interested in the new arrival, approached his sister with a seriousness that made his parents look at each other over his head and experience the particular quiet delight of people watching their children discover each other. The farmhouse grew. Clyde added 2 rooms onto the original structure through the winter of 1881 and into the spring of 1882, doing much of the work himself with Pete's help and Eli's occasional assistance. And Jane redesigned the kitchen garden in the new spring with twice the space and her mother's seed packets planted in one corner, a deliberate continuity, a line from Missouri to Texas, and from one kind of life to another. The cattle and the crops found their rhythm together, the way things do when the people managing them have learned how to manage themselves. The quarterly grazing rights agreement that had started it all had long since been folded into the broader reality of 2 properties that function now as something approaching one, though the deeds remained separate, because Jane had always believed that a woman should hold what is hers, and Clyde had always believed she was right. By the summer of 1882, Dusty Creek had grown. A new doctor had arrived, a man named Pemberton who set up practice in the building next to the telegraph office. A schoolhouse was built at the south end of town, which pleased Jane enormously, and which she contributed to financially in a way that she kept quiet about. The town was becoming something, the way small western towns in the 1880s became things, imperfect and vital and full of the specific energy of people deciding to stay somewhere and make it mean something. Covington's name in the county continued to mean something different than it had before Jane had arrived. He was not universally beloved, because the old stories did not disappear entirely, and because he was not a man who worked at being liked. He worked at being fair, which is a different thing. But he was respected in a way that had a different quality than the respect his reputation had produced before, the respect that comes from knowing a man will do what he says and not look for the gap. He said once to Pete. In a conversation Pete later relayed to Eli, who relayed it to Jane with the faithful accuracy of someone who understood its significance, that the best decision he had ever made was the one he had initially been forced into, which was to deal honestly with the woman on the East property. "She made me an agreement I could not find a reason to break," Covington had said. "Not on paper, just by being what she is." Pete had asked what kind of agreement that was. "The kind where you are seen clearly," Covington had said, "and you cannot stand the thought of being less than what is seen. That is the only kind that holds." Jane, when she heard this, sat with it for a long time. She thought about the long road from Missouri, about the first day in Dusty Creek with dust on her shoulders and a deed in her bag, and no particular certainty about anything except that she was going to make something of what she had. She thought about the man on the roan horse at the fence line who had told her posts were crooked and had not known, none of them had known, what would come from that first conversation. She thought about agreements and what made them real. Not the paper, though the paper mattered. Not the witnessing, though that mattered too. What made an agreement real was the person making it, the depth from which they made it, whether they were making it from their whole self or only from the part of themselves that was currently convenient. Clyde had learned to make agreements from his whole self. She had, in some sense, called that self out of him, not created it. It had always been there, but held it up to the light and said, "Look, this is the one worth being," and he had looked and agreed. In the fall of 1882, they attended the county fair together, the four of them, Harold at 3 years old running ahead of them on the fairgrounds with the inexhaustible energy of a small person, experiencing everything for the first time at full force. Clara in Jane's arms watching everything with those serious green eyes. Clyde walked beside Jane with his hand at the small of her back the way he did in crowds, not possessive, just present, and she leaned into it slightly because she had stopped being careful about showing what she felt. They watched Harold try to win a ring toss and fail spectacularly, and then try again with the unswerving determination that was apparently a trait he had inherited from both sides in equal measure. They ate corn and watched the cattle judging and ran into Darrow and his wife, and stopped to talk for a while. A genuine conversation now, comfortable in the way that things are when the history between people has been settled rather than avoided. Rosalinda found them near the pie tables and hugged Jane, and inspected Clara with the authority of someone who had been watching this family accumulate itself from the beginning and had opinions about all of it. She told Harold he was getting tall, which Harold received with great seriousness. The afternoon went golden and long the way October afternoons do in Texas when the heat has finally stepped back and the air is clear, and Jane stood at the edge of the fairground with Clara, now asleep against her shoulder, and Clyde beside her, and Harold at their feet, examining something in the grass with total concentration. And she looked out at the flat horizon with the wide Texas sky above it, and felt the specific fullness of a life that had been built deliberately. By choice and by work, and by the willingness to believe in something before it was entirely certain. Clyde glanced at her and saw something in her face. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I am glad I came here," she said. "That I am glad I fixed those fence posts crooked enough to give you something to comment on." He laughed. That genuine laugh she had first heard across a table in Clara's establishment, the one that came from somewhere real. "Your posts were very crooked," he said. "They were slightly crooked," she said, "and they are perfectly straight now." "Everything you have put your hand to is perfectly straight now," he said, and his voice had that quality she knew, the one that meant he was saying more than the words. She looked at him, at the man who had ridden up to her fence on a roan horse with a reputation made of broken agreements and had become, against everything that reputation suggested, the most steadfast person she knew. Not everything was straight to begin with, she said. He held her gaze, and there was in it the full weight of what they both understood, who he had been, what he had chosen, how far the distance was between the two, and how he had crossed it. "No," he said quietly, "but it is now." The years that followed settled into something that felt, to both of them, like the right shape of a life. Harold grew into a boy who loved horses and numbers in equal measure, and who had his mother's stubbornness and his father's steadiness, a combination that Jane privately thought was the best possible outcome. Clara grew into a person of such specific and articulate opinion that by the time she was 3 years old, she was conducting what amounted to negotiations about bedtime, which her father found secretly hilarious, and her mother found both exasperating and deeply recognizable. A third child arrived in 1884, a second son they named Thomas, who had Jane's auburn hair and a temperament so placid and cheerful that both his parents spent the first weeks of his life waiting for something to be wrong before concluding that some people simply arrive in the world easy, and that this was a gift rather than a mystery to be solved. The farm by this point had become significant in the region, one of the better-run mixed operations in the county, with a grain yield that other farmers consulted with Jane about because she had developed, over the years, an understanding of the land and the weather and the relationship between the two that came from paying the kind of attention that could not be faked. She had also become something in the town that she had not exactly planned to be, a person people came to with questions about crops and about property and occasionally about other things, about how to handle a situation or how to say something that needed to be said. She was not a woman who sought authority, but she had found that being honest and practical and reliable in a consistent way meant that people began to trust you with things, and she did not mind being trusted. The schoolhouse needed a teacher in the fall of 1884, as the previous teacher had moved on to a larger town, and Jane was asked by the school committee whether she might consider taking the position on a part-time basis through the winter months when the farm work was lighter. She considered it, discussed it with Clyde, who pointed out that it would mean earlier mornings for both of them, but that he thought she would be extraordinary at it, and that he was fully prepared to manage accordingly. She took the position. She taught reading and arithmetic and basic history to 16 children ranging from 6 to 14 years old in the one-room schoolhouse at the south end of Dusty Creek, and she did it with the same directness and care she brought to everything. And the children, who were sometimes difficult in the way that children are, responded to it because children understand at some level below words when an adult is fully present with them. Harold was in her class for one winter, which had its own set of interesting dynamics that they negotiated at home with considerable humor. He was her best student, which she could not say at school, and he knew it, which she could not do anything about. Clyde came to the schoolhouse once, in December of that first teaching winter, on a Friday afternoon when Jane had stayed late to organize the shelves of the sparse library of books that had been donated over the years. He appeared in the doorway and stood there watching her arrange the books by size because there were too few to organize by subject, and she looked up and found him there with the late afternoon light behind him and Harold beside him tugging at his coat sleeve and Clara on his hip and Thomas in his arms, the whole family arriving in the doorway of the schoolhouse like a painting of something. She set the book down and looked at all of them. "We came to walk you home," Harold announced. "All three of you came to walk me home," she said. "All four of us," Clyde corrected, and something in the way he said it, quietly and with everything he meant in it, made her feel the same thing she had felt on the porch in October of 1878, the warmth of something certain and true. She gathered her coat and her bag and walked out of the schoolhouse into the December afternoon with her family around her, Harold's hand in hers. Clara transferred to her hip by some wordless negotiation, Thomas back with his father, and Clyde walking beside her on the main street of Dusty Creek in the cold winter light. The town was quiet in the late afternoon, the storefronts lit from within as the dark came early, the smell of wood smoke and cold air and horses, and the particular smell of a frontier town in winter, which was alive and impermanent and entirely real. By the end of that walk, which was not long, back to the east property and the farmhouse with the 2 added rooms and the kitchen garden laid dormant under the cold and the wide Texas sky above everything. Jane felt something that she had not felt since she was very young, before the losses, before the long uncertainty. She felt safe. Not in a small or contained sense, not the safety of someone who has retreated from the world, but the safety of someone who has gone all the way out into it and found that it held. She felt held. On the porch that evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet with the good quiet of sleeping children, she and Clyde sat in the 2 chairs that had always been there and drank coffee in the cold, their breath visible in the air between them, the stars in their usual overwhelming Texas abundance above. He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand, and she turned hers over to hold his, and they sat like that for a while without talking, because there are conversations that happen below words, in the sustained contact of 2 people who have chosen each other fully and kept choosing, and they had become fluent in that particular conversation. "Are you happy?" he asked her eventually. He asked it the way he asked things he genuinely wanted to know the answer to, without preamble and without assumption. She looked out at the land, at the dark shapes of the fields and the barn and the fence line that ran east toward the Covington range, and at the stars above all of it. "I am," she said, "more than I knew how to want." He squeezed her hand. "Me too," he said. "Clyde," she said. "Yes. That agreement you made," she said. "The one you said you could not find a reason to break." He looked at her, waiting. "How is it holding?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him thinking about it seriously, the way he thought about things he wanted to answer honestly. "It is the only thing I have ever had," he said at last. "That gets stronger the longer it runs. Every agreement I ever made before, every deal, they started strong and found their weakness. This one," he paused. "Every year that passes I can find less reason to break it. Every year I want it more, not less. That is not something I knew was possible." She looked at him in the starlight, this man who had been known for breaking every agreement he made, and who had made one he could not find a reason to break and had held it every day, with a faithfulness that had rebuilt not just his reputation but himself. "It is the same for me," she said quietly. "Every day I am more certain of it, more certain of you." He leaned over from his chair and kissed her gently, the way he kissed her when they were alone and quiet and the world had contracted to just the 2 of them, and it was not a dramatic gesture. It was simply the truest one. The Texas night was cold and clear and enormous above them. The stars did what they had always done and would always do, burning quietly and without acknowledgement of the small lives below them, the children asleep in the farmhouse, the cattle on the range, the fields waiting for spring, and 2 people on a porch who had found, in this unlikely place and from this unlikely beginning, the thing that made everything else make sense. They sat there for a long time, her hand in his, both of them looking at the sky, and everything that needed to be resolved had been resolved, and everything that needed to be said had been said, and what remained was exactly what they had built, real and solid and theirs, in the full and present sense of a life that had been chosen and kept and loved into permanence. The porch creaked slightly in the wind. The stars burned on, and the agreement held.